There's malaise in Western culture. We see it everywhere, from the rise of postmodernism and its implicit rejection of Enlightenment principles through to the replacement of rationalism with wokery in almost every field of human endeavour. This tendency is perhaps most apparent within academia, particularly tertiary institutions. But are our universities just a symptom, or, as it seems to me, a significant contributing factor? A factory of dumb ideas detracting from society, polluting public discourse, and dismantling civilization. Here at the dawn of the new dark ages, James Kierstead joins me to discuss this. Dr. Kierstead is a scholar and an academic, holding postgraduate degrees from some of the world's most prestigious institutions. These days, he is a fellow at the New Zealand Institute. Good afternoon, Dr. Kierstead.
Hi there, thanks for having me. I should just say, it used to be the New Zealand Institute. We're now called the New Zealand Initiative, which is sort of less of a natural name in some ways, so people always get it wrong. But yeah, we're the Initiative now. We used to be the Institute.
All right, I'm sorry about that, and thank you for the correction. Can you tell us a little bit about that organisation, what its objectives are, and the problems it perceives and the solutions it proposes?
Sure. So we're a think tank, basically. We're a policy shop, and we're funded by subscribers, and these tend to be big corporates. I think we've got about 100. There's a list on our website. And we're a think tank, as I say, so we basically are interested in good policies for New Zealand. And generally, I would say it's an open secret that our philosophical orientation is, vaguely, generally in favor of growth, in favor of the open society, free speech, free markets. But I think we're also pragmatists. I think nobody here is an absolute radical who thinks we need to completely dismantle the state or, do away with regulation of all sorts. So we look at things on a case-by-case basis. And I really work here on higher education, on universities. I also write the odd article about democracy and foreign affairs and things like that. But mainly my job now is to write reports on discrete policy issues in the world of New Zealand universities. So I did a report on the number of administrators at New Zealand universities, which is higher than anywhere else in the Anglophone world that I could find in terms of the number of non-academics per academic. It's about 1.4, which is actually, as I say, quite high. Last year, I wrote a big report on academic freedom in New Zealand, where I found lots and lots of episodes where free speech was being violated. We had lots of testimonies from academics saying that they felt under threat if they criticized the university administration or some of the sort of official positions that universities have taken up. I had, I think, 5 different surveys that I surveyed. I, reviewed those surveys, which again is more evidence that academics and students feel that they can't speak, that they're inhibited on certain topics, the topics that you might expect, Treaty of Waitangi, gender and sex, that sort of thing. And now I've just started work on a new report, which is going to be about grade inflation. And I don't want to tell you exactly what we found because we have to triple check everything. But I can say that there's a lot of grade inflation in New Zealand. Those grades are going up and up in quite a dramatic way. So hopefully I'll be able to tell people more about that in a few months.
Okay, that's absolutely fascinating stuff. In terms of this self-reporting exercise that you wrote the article about, do you have a breakdown across disciplines and faculties of the people that responded to that survey?
Sorry, are you talking about the academic freedom surveys?
Yes.
So there are several different surveys. Let's see if I can do this off the top of my head. So 2 of them are from the Free Speech Union. And they sent emails out to academics, I think, at all the New Zealand universities. We had one internal survey at the University of Auckland, where I think they did all the faculties at the University of Auckland, but it was just the University of Auckland. And we had one survey that I was involved in doing of undergraduate students. That was done by a group called Heterodox New Zealand, which is a chapter of Heterodox Academy, which is a US-based organization that's interested in viewpoint diversity and free speech at universities. And then I think we had 1 or 2 surveys that I mentioned that were by the Tertiary Education Union. And they're a bit older. They're from, I think, 2018 to 2019. And we think that all these surveys, when put together, give us a pretty good sense that there is a problem. Some people have criticized aspects of these surveys, I think rightly enough. 2023 Free Speech Union survey had a very low response rate, for example. And so then there's the possibility of selection bias, i.e. the only people who respond are people who are really riled up about the issue. But I would point out that a lot of these other surveys, they make up for that deficiency. So, for example, the University of Auckland internal survey, that had a response rate of 67%, which is a stonking response rate. And, that 2023 Free Speech Union survey, the sample size wasn't amazing. It was something like 452. But, you look at the other surveys, the TEU survey, I think the sample size was 2,000 and something. The Heterodox New Zealand one was in the 700s. So, as I say, we think that, taken together, these surveys suggest that there is something going on. And there's been loads of similar surveys done in other parts of the English-speaking world. And obviously, we share a lot of the culture of other parts of the English-speaking world. And those surveys suggest that there's a problem in the States, there's a problem in Canada, there's a problem in the UK, there's a problem in Australia with free speech at universities. And would you believe it? Often the things that people worry about talking about are very similar to what people worry about talking about in New Zealand universities. Not necessarily the Treaty of Waitangi, because those countries don't have the Treaty of Waitangi, but indigenous topics and race and sex and things like that.
All right. Well, I've got to say, from the outside looking in, from outside the academy looking in, it seems, while I think it is valuable to be providing that sort of data via survey, I don't think there's any argument that there is an orthodoxy inside tertiary institutions, and those quote-unquote academics who fail to adhere to it are often ostracized. I think that an organization calling itself heterodox sounds like a pretty wonderful kind of antidote to that tendency. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, there's no argument maybe in certain circles outside the university. I think a lot of the battle for public perceptions has been lost, in the sense that a lot of people are looking at what's going on in universities and thinking, wow, this stuff is pretty crazy, or some of this stuff is pretty crazy. But I think within the university and within, what you might call the Ponikatanga, the sort of Wellington-based elite, and it's similar in other countries, there's a lot of denialism about this. So if you talk to people at the universities, a lot of people will say there's no problem. And to be honest, like, a lot of that is because most academics are very left-wing. And so I've talked to academics about this, like friends of mine, who looked me in the eye and said, but James, I never have any problem saying what I want to say. Whenever I want to talk about postmodernism or Marxism or, radical feminism, well, actually, that one might run into some trouble nowadays because of the whole idea of turfism, the so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists who get into trouble for denying that, gender is more important than sex. But, yeah, anyway, so I've lost my thread there a little bit. But.
Yeah, you were talking about how there is a denial amongst the predominantly left-wing academics that there is any sort of issue.
People say, I have these far left beliefs and I don't have any problems speaking about those, and that's kind of obvious because those are the ideas which are sort of allowed and licensed and encouraged. It's the people who have different beliefs or even questions about some of those orthodoxies that get into trouble.
All right. James, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up an article that I appreciate that you can't see, but the audience can. And it's this open response in defence of science New Zealand listener letter. And I think this probably informs some of our discussion in that regard. This is a letter, guys, in response to 7 prominent academics who co-wrote an article that was printed in a New Zealand circular suggesting that Mataranga Maori, which is traditional sort of indigenous folklore, does not deserve equal footing with actual science. Now, many academics disagreed vehemently with that position. I would say that every academic who did sign the letter disagreeing with that proposition is unworthy of the description. Now, let me read you the text of the letter that these New Zealand academics signed. A letter signed by 7 University of Auckland professors emeritus, published in the New Zealand Listener, July 23rd, claims to be in defence of science against what is described as an effort to encourage mistrust of science. We, the signatories to this response, categorically disagree with their views. Indigenous knowledge, in this case Mataranga, meaning Maori-specific folklore, are not lesser to other knowledge systems. Indeed, indigenous ways of knowing, including Mataranga, have always included methodologies that overlap with Western understandings of the scientific method. However, Mataranga is far more than just equivalent or equal to Western science. It offers ways of viewing the world that are unique and complementary to other knowledge systems. The 7 professors describe efforts to re-evaluate and revise the significance of Mataranga in NCEA, which is a New Zealand secondary school educational standard, including the acknowledgement of the role Western science has played in rationalising colonisation as contributing to disturbing misunderstandings of science emerging at all levels of education and in science funding. The professors claim that science itself does not colonize, ignoring the fact that colonization, racism, misogyny, and eugenics have each been championed by scientists wielding a self-declared monopoly on universal knowledge. And while the professors describe science as universal, they fail to acknowledge that science has long excluded Indigenous people from participation, preferring them as subjects for study and exploitation. Diminishing the role of Indigenous knowledge systems is simply another tool for exclusion and exploitation. The professors present a series of global crises that we must battle with science, again failing to acknowledge the ways in which science has contributed to the creation of these challenges. Putting science on a pedestal gets us no further in the solutions of these crises. Finally, they believe that mistrust of science is increasing by this kind of critique. In contrast, we believe that mistrust in science stems from science's ongoing role in perpetuating scientific racism, justifying colonization, and continuing support of systems that create injustice. There can be no trust in science without robust self-reflection by the science community and an active commitment to change. This letter was arranged by 2 quote-unquote scientists closely associated with the previous Labour government, Professor Sean Hendry and Associate Professor Susie Wiles. But the interesting aspect is the number of signatories to this letter. It is astonishing. There must be 5,000 or so people who are consider themselves academic or are academic adjacent. So I have to say to you, James, given that this is the prevailing orthodoxy, how can any of these people be receiving public funding when they are quite obviously, every one of these signatories is not deserving of any sort of publicly funded role in academia, in my opinion? And secondly, how do we convince these people to change their minds?
Well, look, it's very tough. I mean, I think a lot of the people who sign those letters are probably actually fairly decent scientists, and they're probably doing fairly good work in their professional life. I mean, there are pockets of the university where I think the research is very poor indeed, and maybe not worth public funding. But there's a strange paradox, or kind of something very unexpected, but I think true about the current mood we're going through, which is that you can get people who are very intelligent and and are very knowledgeable and who are doing good work, but they get caught up in these kinds of sort of mobbing dynamics. And I'm not excusing them. I think it's a terrible thing to do. Yeah, that's one of the complicated things about reforming the universities. There are these pockets of, I would call, sort of sheer lunacy, but there are also substantial bits of the university which are, populated by people who are doing fairly serious work. So that's a difficulty. But no, I mean, I agree. The listener letter was a big wake up call, I think, for New Zealand academia, and for New Zealanders looking at the university. I think it was a big sort of clarion call of the fact that we have a big problem. If people take a look at my report on academic freedom in New Zealand, which is on the New Zealand Initiative website, I actually do like a monster review of the whole episode, the listener letter. And I like to think it's one of the best treatments out there, one of the fullest treatments of the listener letter episode. I think one of the things people don't realize about this is how swift and how comprehensive the blowback was. So these 7 professors signed a letter to a magazine, and in ordinary times, they might have expected in the next edition of the magazine, there's going to be 1 or 2 letters against them. And I think there were actually people who wrote letters into the magazine against their position. But, what they also got was denunciation. They got, I think the University of Auckland Vice Chancellor came out and said, I defend their rights to free speech, but she basically made clear that Auckland University took a position different to that stated in the letter. The Royal Society obviously put out a statement against them as well. including on X, the New Zealand Association of Psychologists. There were all these groups that lined up to denounce them. And if you go to my report, I've actually put down the date of all these things happening as well, including that letter. And a lot of them happened within days. Within days of the letter appearing, all of these denunciations went up. And for me, that's kind of suspicious and quite strange and unexpected, because I actually take, maybe I'm rare in this, but like, I'm an academic, or I was, and if I read a letter about a complex issue, such as the nature of science, it takes me a few days to formulate a response, and I want to get it right, and I want to check things. So for me, it was sort of not very good practice for people just to immediately respond. And the emotional tone of the letter that you read, I think, was quite angry, and it seemed like they were trying to denounce people rather than argue with them. Now, there is some
You,
intellectual content in the letter that we can come to, but I think the main point I want to make at this stage is, it's fine to discuss the nature of Maturanga Maori and whether or not it's science. And of course, it's fine to criticize the letter writers and have a different position. But I just think it could have been done in a much more civilized way. And I agree with you that we should expect higher standards from our academics, just in terms of civil discourse and arguing in a professional manner.
yeah, well, certainly it did appear to be an absolutely coordinated struggle session. For those distinguished professors who wrote that letter, that had significant impacts upon them, both personally and professionally. But the broader perspective is that it made New Zealand an absolute laughingstock internationally in terms of the academic reputation of New Zealand's institutions, and indeed New Zealand academics and New Zealand trained academics. What has been the damage to us internationally?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, one other complicated thing about this is that this sort of postmodern view of things has spread so far and wide, and it's such a feature now of academia, especially in the English-speaking world, that there are probably a lot of scientists out there who agreed with the not with the listener letter authors, but with the petition against them. However, having said that, I mean, what kind of blowback there was from some more traditional areas of science. So, for example, Richard Dawkins condemned the Royal Society for not standing up for science. I think Jerry Coyne. So there were, quite reputable, quite well-known British and American scientists who thought that what the Royal Society was up to was fairly ridiculous. They got lots of emails. They got lots of people contacting them saying that they were doing the wrong thing. There was an allegation, I think it's true, in fact, that they initiated a process to investigate two of the letter writers who were members of the Royal Society, who then subsequently resigned, Garth Cooper and Robert Nola, who died a few years ago. The Royal Society claims that they hadn't actually got to the investigation part yet. They just had an initial meeting where a decision was made that they would consider whether those people should be investigated. And they claim that they had to do that automatically because somewhere in their rule book, it says that if anybody files a complaint against you, then you have to go to that stage. Now, I think that they should have just laughed those people out of court. When people came to the Royal Society and said you should initiate some kind of proceedings against two of your fellows who signed the letter, I think that there shouldn't be an automatic reference to this initial body at all. They should just say, that's not something we do. This letter was absolutely fine, and leave it at that. And obviously, the two academics who were involved felt strongly enough about it to just resign. And actually, Robert Nola's response to the Royal Society is, characteristically intelligent. He was a great philosopher of science, among other things. And I think that's still up somewhere online. People can find it, and that sort of defends the principles of philosophical free inquiry, which the Royal Society should have defended.
They absolutely should, and I'm called to mind Stephen Hawking's Professor Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, and it just so happened in the early 1970s that Carl Sagan happened to witness Hawking's investiture ceremony into the Royal Society. The Royal Society, if it is not the oldest scientific fellowship in the world, it is certainly very close to it, and it's certainly one of the most prestigious. And he makes the point, Carl Sagan, and he wrote about this incident as the introduction to, or rather the foreword to Professor Hawking's book. And he makes the point that Hawking was signing his name into a book that on the previous page had Sir Isaac Newton's name written, signed in it. And the Royal Society has utterly besmirched its reputation internationally by participating in this pogrom, by not standing up for science, in my opinion. And I think the root of the issue is that I think, unlike the actual Royal Society itself, the New Zealand chapter, I think it was in 2012, allowed the humanities into what was, until that time, a scientific STEM focused institution. Would that be a fair assessment, that it is the impact of including humanities disciplines into their thinking that has led to this sorry outcome?
It's possible. I mean, I think if you look at the Marsden grants, so these research grants, I mean, they let the humanities and social sciences into them fairly recently, and there's been a lot of public discussion on social media about some of those grants that were given to humanists and social scientists, which look, fairly ridiculous. And I try and be open-minded, and I do defend academic freedom. So, I would defend kind of eccentric academics exploring strange topics, as long as they're doing it in a serious way, and as long as it's also nonpartisan. And I think what bothers people about a lot of the humanities and social science grants that went up there is that, at least on the face of it, I think someone's going to do a more thorough examination of this later, but on the face of it, they're incredibly skewed towards the far left. There's all this really strange progressive stuff. I mean, woke, for lack of a better term. And there's very little that's from a recognizably conservative direction, or indeed from any kind of non-progressive direction. So I think that's worrying, and it seems that that's happening more in the humanities and social sciences. I mean, in principle, I think there's nothing wrong with having a body which defends the sciences and the humanities and social sciences. It's just that we're at a point now where, yeah, there is this rot, or let's say there are concerns about how things are going within university humanities and social science departments. I mean, I would say even there, like I taught for 10 years in the classics program at Victoria University, Wellington. And I would defend the classics program. I think there are pockets of excellence here and there. So it's not all, completely crazy. But this sort of postmodern strain is extremely powerful in some quarters. And yeah, it leads to the skew. And I think that, when these things go to boards that decide who to give the grants to, it's just very difficult for anybody opposing that kind of worldview to stand up against it, because it's so anathema, right? It's so sort of stigmatized. So people who want to speak up against some research project that uses like a Tongan research methodology, which maybe isn't really that sound, it's very difficult to say that and have your comments sort of recorded, because people are afraid of being ostracized by their peers for being racist. Even though
Yeah,
obviously, like, criticizing a research methodology that maybe somebody just made up last week and isn't a real thing, that's not racist. That's just being a good academic, right?
right. I absolutely agree, and I also agree that if there is a discipline that is worth saving in the humanities, that the classics would certainly be one of them. But coming back to the point that you made about the orthodoxy, and in particular Victoria University, I'm just bringing up for the audience an article from the New Zealand Herald that was published in mid-December last year. Now, people will recall that for the first time, our New Zealand census, which went disastrously wrong, it was very badly mismanaged by the previous government, but it was the first census in New Zealand's history that asked issues around sexuality and gender, and the results were extremely interesting, and I thought that I would read some of that to you now. The figure that really struck me is this, and this article comes to us from Azaria Howe and Chris Knox in the New Zealand Herald. It was published on the 15th of December, titled "Census Data Reveals Wellington Neighbourhood Has the Most Rainbow Identifying Residents." The 2023 census was the first time all New Zealanders were asked about their sexual orientation, with about 4.2% of the population aged 15 plus identifying as LGBTIQ plus or rainbow. The Wellington neighbourhood, where Victoria University's warehouse is located, and I think this probably means Kelburn, is much higher at 51.2%, the highest in the country. So, with a national average of 4.2% of New Zealanders identifying as LGBTQ plus and so on, 11 times that number happen to identify within that group, which is just an astonishingly massive figure in comparison. And the question I would have for you is, given that that is the case inside in the vicinity of of one of New Zealand's major tertiary institutions, how is it possible for anyone there as a student, as a visitor, as an academic to say that there is, for example, only two biological sexes?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult, as the survey suggests. That, as I said, after the Treaty of Waitangi, sex/gender was the top issue that people felt inhibited about discussing, and that pertains both to students and academics. So we know that there's a problem with discussing these issues openly. Now, the high number of self-reported LGBTQ plus people in Kelburn, it's very interesting, those figures, because they're very dramatic. I mean, so there are basically two possible explanations. One is that there have always been that number of people who are secretly gay or transsexual or whatever, and because of past stigma, which has now been removed, but the place where people feel most free are university campuses because they're more progressive. Those places are where you see the true number of people who are LGBTQ plus. And there probably is some effect like that, right? Probably there were a lot of people who didn't say they were gay when it was illegal to be gay for obvious reasons, and when you got socially ostracized for being gay. But those figures that you cite are just so high, it makes me think that at least there must be some operation of another dynamic, which is some kind of social contagion, that it just becomes fashionable to identify as LGBT or Q, right? And that seems to be the case on these university campuses across the English-speaking world. And with some of them, like queer, it's actually kind of interesting because it's more like an identity than a sexual orientation. Because if you're a man and you're attracted to men, that used to be called gay, and some people do still identify as gay rather than queer. But the queer thing is almost like it's like a style of being gay, right? So that's interesting, because if there's a shift towards that, it suggests that that's not necessarily just people who are attracted to people of the same sex coming out and saying that they are attracted to people of the same sex. It's also this kind of shift in fashion. And you might say, a shift in fashion isn't such a bad thing, and I would agree. Like, fashions can shift, and that's fine. But as you say, all of this contributes to a picture of what our universities are like. And there are places where particular types of fashion are extremely operative and extremely powerful. And obviously, if you're on the wrong side of those fashions, if you don't agree with them, or if you try and discuss them in a rational manner like we're discussing them now, then you can be in trouble, and sometimes a lot of trouble.
Which is astonishing that and this you often see this an example of this in the trans debate, where the strategy that has been adopted for about 10 years by the rainbow community is extremely militant, and it's based around the concept of no debate. No, we are just not going to platform anyone whose ideas we disagree with. We're not going to debate them. We are going to impose cancel culture. We are going to shut them down. And it's another example of the prevailing orthodoxy of thought. And one would expect, particularly as a taxpayer at a public institution, that all thought would be open for debate. And
Yeah,
it
that's
reminds
right.
me.
So let me bring up two more episodes from the report, because I did all the work to write them down. Or actually, I think my colleague Stephanie Martin actually wrote these ones up. But anyway, I did all the effort to compile all these episodes. So yeah, so there were two main examples that we had. I think there were more than that, where TERFs got shut down and deplatformed. So one was the Feminism 2020 conference, which I think was supposed to happen at Massey, and that got cancelled. And then also Daphne Whitmore at AUT, who's a sort of gender critical feminist, her talk got cancelled. And actually, this is just to kind of put this bit in parentheses, but going back to the Royal Society, I was going to comment afterwards that there was another episode with the Royal Society where Ant Poole, a professor from Auckland, was going to do a talk at the Royal Society, and he sent them his abstract and I think maybe a script of his talk. And there was an administrator at the Royal Society who emailed him and then had a series of meetings with him, where she basically told him not to mention the listener letter in his talk, in his abstract. And that was fairly recently. So it proves to me that even after all the hubbub about what the Royal Society did after the listener letter, they still have a lot to learn, and they still need to be reformed. And it seems like on the inside of the Royal Society, it's very difficult to reform them. I think people, I think, voted against Sean Hendy keeping his administrative role at the Royal Society, but he sort of brushed that off. I'm not sure if he's still in that role, but it seems like you can have votes against people that, the majority actually wins that vote and people still remain in place. So as with the universities, I would say there's an argument now that these institutions can't be reformed from inside, right? They're too dominated by one faction. So the government actually has to step in. But yeah, no, just going, that's a parenthesis. So yeah, going back to the gender critical feminism thing, yes, people are being deplatformed for that and prevented from speaking about it. And actually, let me just add, this is something I wrote in the report as well. I think that there is a potential to have very polarized conversations about these topics and for people to get angry at one another and for stigma to increase and for understanding to decrease. I don't want that, but I think that the universities had an opportunity to play the role of a kind of neutral arbiter, bringing good information to bear on these questions and maybe from different perspectives as well. You could have had like a Christian view of the issue. You could have had the point of view of a human biologist, somebody who worked in medical sciences. You could have had the point of view of people who are really into sort of gender theory, and there could have been debates, and they could have been used by the university to show that we're the place where civilized debates can be held on contentious topics. They could have brought in the public, and they really just failed on that front completely. And that's kind of what we're paying them for. Okay, we're paying them for a lot of other things too, teaching and research, but they should serve as a forum. They should lead the way in having these high quality discussions about contentious public issues. And instead, what they have been doing in New Zealand, at any rate, is just banning one side of the conversation. And that's the side of the conversation that's, it just happens to be losing this internal battle within the universities.
Well, I'd have to say, Dr. Kierstead, that the position that you're promoting there is certainly innovative, or at least it would have been 2,000 years ago. I mean, this is just a matter that has been settled for what the purpose is of tertiary institutions and academic inquiry for millennia. But I give you the example also of climate science, where a similar approach is imposed, where you will hear climate scientists, which I don't really like that term. I don't think that academic rigor really does apply in that particular discipline. But you will hear them say, okay, the models didn't predict things accurately. There isn't any empirical evidence. Our predictions were wrong, but the science is settled. And this becomes a maxim. It's just a catchphrase that is used again and again. The science is settled. The science is settled. Anyone who disagrees with this or argues with the prevailing orthodoxy is a climate denier. And ought to be shut down, and so on and so forth. Conversely, when absolute solid examples of academic malpractice, and a good example is the University of East Anglia's climate research and the ClimateGate papers, where they were talking about Nature magazine and saying using Mike's nature trick, meaning Michael Mann, a prominent climate science a climate catastrophe science, using Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. Now, that was absolutely academic malfeasance, and there was no consequence. Conversely, anyone who pointed it out faced professional and often personal consequences for standing up for the truth, just like the listener 7. So what I'm getting to here, and I know I'm being very, very long-winded, is that this culture of orthodoxy and not heterodoxy has permeated through from the humanities and social sciences into what is nominally STEM science. An example of that is the Royal Society in 2012 here in New Zealand, allowing those faculties to join. And it just seems to me from the outside looking in that it is a rot that has spread through the institutions. And again, from the outside looking in, I look at it as a taxpayer and I think, okay, what is the value to society of the taxpayer funding that me and every other taxpayer puts in of continuing to allow these people to do what they do?
Yeah, so the climate change science thing is really interesting. I mean, I think again, like there probably is a lot of perfectly good work done by academics on climate change, and I think they have sophisticated models. Then there are all these sort of philosophical questions about can we really model things that are as uncertain as that? It's very complicated, and what are the degrees of probability, and so on and so forth. I think there are lots of people doing serious work. It's just as you say that it's incredibly one-sided, And I think that a lot of people at universities would say, well, it's one-sided because all the facts are on one side. But I think the test of that is, what about if you get scientists who are clearly very intelligent, who are clearly highly credentialed, who are presenting work that is clearly, mathematically sophisticated and has empirical elements to it? What happens to them if they actually challenge the narrative, or challenge the orthodox view? And the answer seems to be what happened to Peter Ridd at James Cook University, who is someone we interviewed on the Free Kiwis podcast that I do with my colleague Michael Johnston here. He was basically driven out. I can't remember all the details, but he had to take the university to court, and the result is he's no longer a professor. That's what happens. And he's someone who's a highly intelligent man. I think he actually has a PhD in physics, but he was studying the effects of light on the atmosphere and so on and so forth. And he obviously has like a very high level understanding of these things. So, and as you say, I mean, you could multiply examples of that. So obviously that's very troubling. Again, I mean, this thesis that the problem is just that we gave the humanities too much sort of rope to work with. It is possible. I mean, I think I do see this phenomenon a lot in the university of the tail wagging the dog. You have these highly qualified scientists who have pretty clear ideas about science just from their practice, and then you get people in the humanities who've maybe studied the history of the philosophy of science, and they have these very sort of relativistic views about science, that it's just a practice along other practices, like Maori traditional lore, for example. And then, funnily enough, even though I often think those arguments are weaker, those ideas are the ones that tend to dominate. And I'm not really sure how this comes about, but there is something troubling there with the kind of weaker ideas somehow coming to dominate the stronger ones. But I think you can't take away guilt entirely from the scientists themselves. I mean, I know a lot of scientists who hate this stuff and want to defend science, but I've also observed in New Zealand and elsewhere, there are a lot of scientists who go along with it. Either they're not thinking critically enough to actually know how to disagree with it, or they're just cowards. They know that it's wrong and they know that they should stand up against it, but they don't. And I mean, I think it's absolutely, well, it's very interesting, let's say, that in New Zealand, for example, we've had this whole debate about sex and gender. There are a lot of biologists who basically, I'm not going to use the word no, but let's say they have a lot of evidence in their field that sex in humans is binary. And we haven't really heard much from them on this topic. That's been left to activists and feminists and journalists and so on to actually make that argument. We heard very little from the actual biologists, and I think that's a shame. I mean, I do think it's difficult for me to come out and say we should just completely defund the university. I had this conversation with Peter Boghossian again on the Free Kiwis podcast recently. He was saying similar things to you, that we should just remove all funding from the university. I think, again, I mean, there are lots of good people at the university who are doing solid work, and they just have their head down, and they're doing research on cancer, or they're doing research on astronomy or something like that, or Roman history. They're doing serious research on that, and maybe they haven't spoken up about things enough. But I just think it would be a bit over the top to kind of completely deprive them of their livelihood. Now, whether the universities deserve the level of public support and the level of public funding that they've hitherto enjoyed, that's a good question. And I think in the States, you can see in surveys that you ask Democrats and Republicans whether they think universities are a good thing for the country. And both of those numbers have fallen dramatically. Obviously, especially for Republicans, because they're on the right, they see the universities as radical left, which is actually correct. But also independents and Democrats, they have less confidence in universities. I haven't seen any similar surveys in New Zealand, but I'd be very surprised if it was very different. I mean, my sense is very much that people see what's going on in universities and they think increasingly, why is my tax money paying for this? And I also think, even though there are good people doing solid research at the universities, I was very frustrated the last few years when I started talking about these things. And some friends were sort of honorable exceptions to this, and they actually took me seriously and talked to me about these things. But a lot of people would just dismiss it, you know? And I sort of thought, look, guys, you have a window of, like, let's say, I thought it would be like 10 or 20 years where you can choose to engage with reform and the problems that the universities are suffering from, and maybe we'll get somewhere. Or you can just sort of act in this puerile manner and say, none of it's happening. You guys are all fascists. And on the whole, the response from people within the university has been the second. And that's the case in New Zealand as well. On the whole, academics have chosen just to try and dismiss critics as racist or sexist or whatever, rather than engaging with their claims. And I think that's a shame. And I think that window I thought universities had, 5 to 10 years, or what did I say, 10 to 20 years, that's actually, it's appearing now as if that's going to be a much shorter time frame than everybody thought, because in the States, Trump and people like Ron DeSantis in Florida are going to go hard against the universities in ways that I wouldn't even endorse. They're completely taking over departments. They're shutting down gender studies, which I think violates academic freedom. But my point is, there was always going to be a blowback. And I think we're starting to see that in Australia and New Zealand too. In New Zealand, with the removal of humanities and social science grants from the Marsden program. And again, the academics were all up in arms. They were almost like shocked by it. How dare you do this? But people have been telling them for years. Good people within the university were telling their colleagues there's a serious problem in the universities. We need to do something. And they were just dismissed as racist or, crazy. And a lot of them ended up on the outside of the academic system, like myself. So at this point, I'm afraid I have less and less sympathy with universities. So yeah, I think it would be going much too far just to completely defund everybody. But yes, the time has come for very serious reform. The universities, the academics, most of them themselves have signaled that they're not going to do this themselves. So the government will have to do it.
All right, and I certainly take your point that throwing out the baby with the bathwater is perhaps not a wise course of action. And you also make a very good point about Trump and DeSantis and the pendulum swinging back across the Western world, particularly in the Anglosphere, within the Anglosphere, and it's really about how far that pendulum is going to swing. Personally, despite the deficiencies that I expect from a Trump administration, I think that this is one time where I'm actually going to welcome American cultural imperialism. I like to see the end of, the institutionalized racism and sexism that is things like DEI programs, and I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a little bit of defunding happening in that regard. Now, I recall I happened to be a party to a discussion amongst senior decision makers in the public sector around about the time that New Zealand introduced fees for students, and the consensus around that table was that there is a certain amount of value to the individual of holding a tertiary degree, and there's a certain amount of value to society, and it's about cost benefit for both parties in that regard. And I think about that and like, what is the value to an individual today of an academic qualification at tertiary level? And I think it is, as you say, a lot less than it once was, because in the general public, it is not so much valued. But coming back to a point that you made a little while ago about reform, I do think that it would seem, I'm interested in your opinion. From the outside looking in, it does not appear to me that universities have the capability to reform themselves, that it must be an external influence. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean that's really the intent of what I was saying. I guess is that it's really difficult within the university, and I suppose I'm informed here by my own personal experience. I actually started a few years ago a group called Heterodox Classics, so that was another chapter of Heterodox Academy. It was actually one of the first so-called heterodox communities, which are these chapters of Heterodox Academy. I think in any subject in the world, I think the first three were maybe psychology, sociology, and classics, and I was, optimistic. Other people might say incredibly naive. I might even say that myself now, looking back. But I was optimistic, and to be fair to me, I was raised in this atmosphere. I came up through the university system, kind of buying the claims that academics made for themselves, that they were all driven by rationality, an honest search for the truth. Above all, just open debate and discussion and evidence-based inquiry. And so I thought, well, look, I'm not doing anything wrong. No one could possibly have a problem with me if I'm just, defending these values of free inquiry. And I think, like a lot of people, I had this very interesting experience of, starting this group and writing to people, or occasionally I would go to conferences and I would say, I would do a talk on Greek history. And at the end, I would say, by the way, there's also a meetup for people interested in heterodox classics. It's a group, dedicated to viewpoint diversity and free speech, etc. And it was very interesting. I mean, I remember one conference I did that at, and the reception Heterodox Classics meeting was going to be at this pub, and I think something like 6 people turned up in person, and I got something like a dozen additional emails from people who were at the conference in that city, saying to me, basically, "I like what you're doing, but I'm too afraid to show up in person." It, it,
Wow.
it's it's insane how scared people are. I mean, I thought it was insane how scared people are, but then now I'm outside of academia, so maybe I was the insane one. But yeah, no, people are very frightened, and that's something again I can back up with data. It's not just my personal anecdotes. If you look in the report I did on academic freedom, there are a lot of testimonies from academics who say exactly that. They say, I'm afraid of talking about these topics, and one of my main fears is that the next time there are a package of cuts at my university, I will find myself out of a job. And I actually think it's still the case. I actually think it's still true that most academics exaggerate. They have exaggerated fears of how likely that is to happen. Like for every academic, and there are lots of examples of academics who've been just unceremoniously sacked because of their views. But for every one of those, there are probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 people who are actually quite heterodox and talk about these things openly, and they still have an academic job. So I think academics could have actually been a lot braver than they have been, to put it mildly. But yeah, it's very difficult. And as you say, I mean, within the universities, the situation, I mean, one way of getting a handle on this is to look at, there's a brilliant graph that I've tweeted out various times. People can probably find it just by Googling it, where it's a breakdown of the right left ratio in various disciplines in the United States. And the researchers did this by registered Democrats versus registered Republicans. It's an easy way of doing it, right? And so people might be listening to this thinking, okay, maybe there are like a few more left wingers in every department than right wingers, but it's basically equal. No, in a lot of subjects, I think in the most even subjects, like something like business studies and economics, they're pretty even. And in those subjects, it's something like a 5-to-1 left-right ratio. So for every one right winger, there's 5 people on the left. That's as equal as it gets, right? And then when you get into the humanities subjects like classics and English, you're talking about sort of 20 to 30 left wingers to every one right winger. And then in a couple of the subjects, I think maybe sociology was one of them, and anthropology, the researchers could not find a single Republican in these fields anywhere in the United States, right? And I haven't got any perfect figures for New Zealand. I have some sort of impressionistic figures for New Zealand, but I've seen similar data for Canada, for the UK, and Australia. There's a left wing slant which isn't just large; it's enormous, and it's increased over the decades. Right? It's increased since the '70s. So it's not just a question that all academics have always been left wing. No, there's some kind of dynamic that the people on the left, it's become increasingly kind of identified, academics have increasingly identified with that almost as their religion. It's become like a tribe. And because of that, they started treating right wingers in a certain way because they were empowered. And academia became increasingly kind of intolerant of and intolerable for conservatives. And then the numbers ramp up because conservatives don't want to join or they get pushed out. And that's the way things have been going. And that's the reality. So if you do stand up, even if you're like me, I think I'm very moderate politically. I would call myself some kind of liberal democratic centrist. There are elements of my thought which used to be considered very left wing, right? Because I'm some kind of radical Democrat. Maybe we'll have time to get onto that. Maybe we won't. But anyway, so even if you're just standing up and saying, I want to defend the values of free inquiry and evidence based discussion, it's very tough. That's the incredible thing. People immediately start to sort of suspect you of being, on the wrong side of things politically. And on the wrong side of things politically means you might be on the center right.
Yeah, that's right, and you're exactly right. Where standing up for free and open inquiry qualifies one in an academic setting as a fascist, and you are right also to describe it as a tribe and as almost a religion. And in point of fact, with sociology, I often refer to it as that, as the Church of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. But coming to your discipline, because within the social sciences and the humanities, and I'm showing a little bit of my own bias here, there are lessons in history, and particularly from the classics. When I look, as I said in the introduction, here at the dawn of the new dark ages, there are lessons from history, and particularly from within your discipline, I think that can offer some solutions. And why I'm asking you about that now is I think we've been going for about 50 minutes, and I think we've defined the problem fairly well. But now I'm really interested in what the potential solutions are, generally from the New Zealand initiative, and also from within your discipline.
Well, so I mean, I think the solution is a long and hard and detail oriented, reasonable program of reform. And it's not all going to happen overnight. It's going to be very difficult, and the result is going to be uncertain for a long time. And, I thought a few years ago, someone asked the question at a sort of heterodox meeting I was at, are the universities even salvageable? At the time, I thought that was kind of an absurd question. What are you talking about? Of course, the universities are salvageable. But now I'm sort of thinking, even though, as I say, there are lots of people doing good work at universities, if the question is, are they going to be rescued from this kind of political bias, this really structural bias that has sort of poisoned them, it's very difficult to say that we're definitely going to win this one. But so I try and look at discrete issues. I mean, that's what I try and do in my research. And I've always taken this view, which again I think has actually proven to be quite naive, but I keep going at it anyway because it's kind of a value for me. I keep taking the view that we should approach things in a rational manner. We should look for evidence, right? And so I do like heterodox academy still, even though arguably they haven't shifted the dial very successfully. They focus on gathering evidence. And so for me, it is important to look, okay, people talk about admin bloat. Okay, is that a problem in New Zealand? We can look at the data. And we find that actually, it's not only a problem in New Zealand. New Zealand, in some ways, is a world leader of admin bloat. Okay, that's interesting. So we can try and reform that. We can try and talk to policymakers about that. Can we do something on that front? Academic freedom, for me, it was about compiling all the evidence because again, we hear a lot of anecdotes, but what do the surveys say? Collect all the evidence on that. And now the next one, grade inflation. So all of these things are things that we can tackle individually. Now, long term, I think that, as I was saying before, I mean, the foundational problem with universities right now, the structural problem, is really this massive political slant. And that is a really hard problem to tackle if you want to be reasonable and sensible about it. Part of me sort of sympathizes with the Trump DeSantis approach, where it's just like go in, and take it over and completely change it. But it's just not ultimately that fair on the people who are being dismissed from their jobs because actually you're kind of doing what your enemy is doing, right? You've become your enemy. You're getting at them and you're firing people for their political views. And I don't think we should do that as a matter of principle. So again, like some people would say, what we need is kind of affirmative action programs or so-called positive discrimination programs for conservatives. But I sort of think, I'm against positive discrimination or affirmative action for Maori people or black people or anyone on the basis of their race and sex. So, it's just very difficult then for me to turn around and say, oh, we should have it for classical liberals and conservatives. So it's very difficult to know what to do about this. I mean, one thing I think is promising is to kind of found either institutions within universities or different institutions with a different focus and different values. You don't necessarily have to explicitly say this institution is going to be conservative, but you can set up like a center for the study of human traditions. A center for the study of great texts and traditions, and you frame it in such a way that you sort of know it's going to attract more conservatives, right? And they come along and they study texts, ancient texts in a conservative way, or something my colleague Michael Johnson might fantasize about. You could say at Vic, we're going to have a new institute for the quantitative study of education policy, right? And you actually put in the founding charter, you have to be doing quantitative work. And that immediately means that people actually have to do evidence-based work. They can't just do bad sociology, which is my impression of what a lot of the research in education faculties is at the moment, right? It's just sort of agitprop, very progressive, but also sort of very ropey methodologically. I think also more competition for the universities would be very helpful. So one idea is that the government could actually give grants to educational startups who would probably not be as big as the universities anytime soon, but they'd be able to compete with them. And that hopefully would start to change the university's behavior. You could have startups saying, look, we're just going to give you a completely down the line, disinterested, politically neutral introduction to sociology, how to study human society in an empirical way, and the universities then hopefully if they saw students leaking to those courses, they would look at their own sociology departments and think, oh my goodness, why is there such a slant? This looks bad. Because at the moment there's no pressure, right? They effectively have a monopoly on higher education. So I think all these things are quite big asks, right? It's quite a big ask to have the government kind of seed fund new institutions. It's a big ask to have them fund, these new institutions within universities. As I say, even if they start doing that, imagine you do get this institute for the study of traditions or something at the center of Vic. It's still going to be the case that most of Vic is incredibly left wing. So these things are just going to take a lot of time, and I think the more kind of blue skies thinking, outside of the box thinking kind of approach that people take is, well, look, maybe universities, the goose is cooked anyway in the next few years because of all the tech that we have and YouTube and so on and so forth. Everything's just going to move online anyway. and so universities are just going to collapse. I'm not sure that's going to happen in the short term, just because credentialing is still a big thing. So you were saying a while ago that you think that people are just going to stop thinking that a university degree is a good thing, and they're not going to hire people. But actually, there's still a graduate premium in New Zealand. I mean, the last time I looked, the last time this was studied, it still seems that people make more money over the long term if they have university degrees. And so the YouTube stuff is great. I mean, I do some of it myself, but ultimately, these kind of new educational startups online, they're going to have to solve the problem of credentialing, and they're going to have to solve the problem of how to make a community of people around students who are doing things online, which is similar to university, because I think that's also where the university gets a lot of its educational power. It's by creating a whole world of incentives with role models, with people maybe you're competing against, people you're trying to impress in your class. All of that also needs to happen in this alternative online world. So that's also not going to happen, I think, in the very short term. But it is hopeful, and I think that the universities, in some ways, have picked a very bad time to be incredibly dogmatic, because there are alternate ways of getting things out there in the way that there weren't, 20 or 30 years ago. So we'll see how it goes, but it's buckle up. It's going to be a long and interesting ride.
It absolutely will, and I do admire your principles, Dr. Kierstead, that using rationalism, evidence, empirical evidence to build the case is the right and proper approach. But I'd suggest to you that you are doing that with people who implicitly reject that. These are postmodernists. It doesn't really matter how much evidence you produce. The rationality of your argument, their feelings, their ideology are always going to top that, and these are the people who are in the ascendancy. So while I certainly admire your principles in that regard, and I think there is value in that approach, I think that and incentivizing change is a good approach to take. I also think that there needs to be a bit of stick along with the
Yeah, no,
carrot.
I mean, this is the story of my life. I mean, which was that American president who said diplomacy is about speaking softly and carrying a big stick? I think Roosevelt, right? The first Roosevelt. So I guess I've tried the speaking softly bit, and then I'm not the one who's going to wield the stick in any sense. But the government has legitimate authority to change things, so that's who I'm appealing to now. So I guess in some ways I've tried to keep my principles, but I've just changed my audience. Initially I was kind of like, oh, we'll do it within classics, within academia. I can argue for these principles, and people will listen to me. And as I say, like, there were some very honorable exceptions, but on the whole, they didn't really listen to me. They just said I was a racist. Okay, well then I'm going to talk to somebody else, and I'm going to talk to the broader public, and I'm going to talk to policymakers and people in government, because the universities have shown they're not going to be reasonable about this. And so ultimately, in New Zealand, it's kind of easier to argue these things because there aren't, they're public universities. There are 8 public universities, and they're getting taxpayer money. So it's very easy to say, well, then it's the government's responsibility, if they're not doing the job that they were designed to do, to actually move in and reform them. It's a little bit harder in the States with all the private universities, right? Because then you have to ask, is the government even allowed to intervene in these institutions? But here it's very clear. I mean, they're being funded by the government. They were founded by the government, and so the government can also fix them if they're broken, and they seem to be increasingly broken.
Yes, that is very, very true, and it is good to see that with this government, and as you say, with the Marsden Fund, with Judith Collins, that they are very much at least signalling that there is going to be a change, and I think that change very much reflects the broader public sentiment. And the other thing I'd say, Dr. Kierstead, is as a layman, I find it extremely gratifying that there are people like you who are prepared to actually stand up, who have the courage to do that, courage that many of your colleagues, as you rightly point out, don't, to stand up and say, look, this is wrong, this is not how things ought to be. Let's at least discuss these issues, and let's endeavour to pursue solutions. So more power to you. I see we've been going for about 59 minutes. So before we finish, is there anything further you'd like to speak about?
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, I'd say we call it a day this time, but why don't you have me on another time? We can talk about Western civilization and sortition, and maybe make it more about just fun things that I'm interested in. Because actually, what you were saying there, thank you very much for what you were saying, but it's kind of interesting because I think I'm one of these academics, and this is the problem. A lot of academics are like this. Ultimately, I'd rather be reading Greek poetry. Really,
So would I.
I'd rather just be writing articles about ancient Greek history but I kind of feel like I had to do this, and I kind of got drawn into it increasingly. So maybe we could next time just talk about actually interesting stuff about the world, which is what universities are supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I would really love that, and because I think that there's an awful lot from your discipline, and given the current fluctuations inside geopolitics, that I think that we've got an awful lot to speak about in that regard, and I'm sorry that we've spent so much time focusing upon it, and I certainly would love to pursue those topics with you in further detail on another occasion.
No, it's great. I mean, I was the one who was insisting I want to talk about university policy. So yeah, it's good. I mean, it's just a can of worms, really. There's so much to talk about, and as I say, it's going to be very complicated to reform them.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. All right. Well, look, I'll say cheerio to our audience. Thank you all for watching, and to Dr. Kierstead for joining me. I hope you found this interesting, and I think that this is a subject that is going to get ever more coverage in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. And hopefully, the two of us will be coming back to talk about it with you then. Good afternoon.